Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee, and in this video we're still in Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. We will be discussing intelligence and give you an introduction to this concept known as intelligence. We have quite a few learning targets. We'll be defining intelligence and listing characteristics of how psychologists measure intelligence. We'll be talking about abstract versus verbal measures, the speed of processing, fluid and crystallized intelligence, this effect known as the Flynn effect. I think you're going to find it really interesting. Stereotype threat and savant syndrome. We'll also discuss how culture influences the definition of intelligence, and we'll be talking about historic and contemporary theories of intelligence, specifically theories put forth by Charles Spearman, Howard Gardner, Robert Sternberg. We'll also be talking about key researchers in the field of intelligence research and testing, specifically Howard Gardner, Charles Spearman, and Robert Sternberg. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. So when I say the word intelligence, what does that even mean? What is it? Is it inborn or can it increase? Can it be quantified in a number? Can you measure it? What do you think? Intelligence in all cultures is basically the capacity to understand the world, to think rationally, and to use resources effectively when faced with challenges. In research studies, intelligence is whatever the intelligence test measures, and this is really important for you to understand. It tends to be school smarts, but not always, and it hasn't always been that way. So who would you say is intelligent? You've got a couple of caricatures here. These are just representations of kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum, but mainstream culture today defines intelligence mostly as someone who is book smart. That definition can change with the times. So an important thing to remember is that psychologists believe that intelligence is a concept and not a thing. When we think of intelligence as a trait or a thing, we commit to an error called reification. This is viewing an abstract, immaterial concept as if it were a concrete thing. Intelligence is not a concrete thing. And despite general agreement among psychologists about the nature of intelligence, there are two controversies that remain. Is intelligence a single overall ability, or is it several specific abilities? And with modern neuroscience techniques, can we actually locate and measure intelligence within the brain? Can we see it in action? We're going to explore what some well-known theorists and researchers have to say about this topic. So first we start with Charles Spearman. He believed that there was a single general factor for all mental ability. He didn't deny that some people have outstanding talents, but he felt that these differences shouldn't blind us to a single general intelligence. Spearman proposed that general intelligence, or G, this is how you will see it on a test, this is how you'll see me refer to it, is linked to many clusters that can be analyzed by factor analysis that create a single underlying aspect of intelligence. We'll talk a little bit more about factor analysis in our next video, but basically understand that it is gathering information from different areas. And when you're talking about general intelligence, you're looking at different factors that create a single underlying aspect of intelligence. For example, people who do well on vocabulary tend to do well on paragraph comprehension. We know that. We've seen that through decades of testing. This is a cluster that helps define verbal intelligence. And there are other general factors that include spatial ability and a reasoning ability. That's just an example. L.L. Thurstone, who was a critic of Spearman, analyzed his subjects not on a single scale of general intelligence, but on 7 clusters of primary mental abilities. And those abilities included word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numeric ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. However, ironically, later psychologists analyzed Thurstone's data, and a persistent tendency between these clusters, otherwise those who excelled in one area scored well on the other areas, suggested some evidence supporting a G factor, that general intelligence that Spearman was talking about all along, that underlies all aspects of intelligence. For example, think of someone who you know of who is athletic. What makes them athletic? Can you define athleticism? Being athletic is a good analogy for having G. Basically, if they're good in one sport, they tend to be good at most sports or many sports. You also see folks who excel in 2 or 3 of these columns. For example, Michael Jordan, who is arguably the greatest NBA player of all time, he also played in minor league baseball and was a great golf player. Kyler Murray, he was a Heisman Trophy winner, he was the #1 pick in the NFL, but turned down major money as a first-round pick in Major League Baseball. And finally, our hometown favorite, Justin Timberlake. Okay, he may not be a great athlete, but he is a scratch golfer and a very talented entertainer, musician, dancer, and pop artist. So he's got a lot of things going on too. Other psychologists and researchers, however, disagreed with Spearman. So we come to Howard Gardner. Gardner supports Thurstone's ideas that intelligence comes in multiple forms. Gardner notes that brain damage may diminish one type of ability but not others. So you've got a biological support there. And according to Gardner, there must be many facets of intelligence. So he came up with this theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner proposes multiple intelligence, 9 different forms of intelligence, each relatively independent of the others. And basically, he's known for saying it's not how smart you are, it's how you are smart. Multiple intelligences. You've got verbal linguistic. This is the capacity to use language to express what's on your mind, as well as to understand other people. You've got logistical or mathematical. This is the ability to understand the underlying principles of some kind of causal system. You have visual spatial. This is the ability to present the spatial world internally in your mind. You can see different aspects of how things are laid out. You've got musical and rhythmic. This is the capacity to think in music, to be able to hear patterns, recognize them, and perhaps manipulate them. You have bodily kinesthetic. This is the capacity to use your whole or parts of your body to solve a problem, make something, or put on a production. You have a naturalist. This is the ability to discriminate among living things as well as a sensitivity to other features of the natural world. You have intrapersonal, having an understanding of yourself, of knowing who you are, what you can do, etc. It's interpersonal. This is the ability to understand other people. And then finally, this is kind of his newest add-on, you have an existential intelligence. This is the ability to exhibit the proclivity to pose and ponder questions about life, death, and ultimate realities. So let's talk about savant syndrome. This is when someone has an extremely high ability in one specific area, accompanied by significant delays or deficits in other areas of intelligence. If you've ever seen the movie Rain Man, that's what I'm talking about. And it serves as evidence for this idea of multiple intelligences. We're going to sit back and watch this amazing artist. He is known as a savant, and even though he doesn't have an IQ that is typically thought of as being high, he is a genius in the area of artistic ability. So let's. And Sternberg was famously quoted as saying, "If IQ rules, it is only because we let it. And when we let it rule, we choose a bad master. We got ourselves into the test mess. We can get ourselves out of it." So he definitely had an opinion about testing intelligence. Okay, so what he said was that these 3 intelligences are assessed and seen in different ways. You have analytical intelligence, and this is basically what we think of when we think of as intelligence. It's assessed by intelligence tests. Creative intelligence, this is what makes us adapt to novel situations, generating novel ideas. And then you have a practical intelligence. This is that intelligence that's required for everyday tasks, basically what's known as street smarts or common sense. So you can have mixtures of all 3. First, you have the analyzer, fares well in academic environments, but isn't likely to make a creative contribution to the field. You have the creator. This is someone who generates ideas easily but is unable to analyze these ideas or put them into practice. You have the practitioner. This is someone who is persuasive and maybe entertaining but lacks substance in thinking. You have the analytical creator. This is someone who is able to analyze created ideas but doesn't easily communicate these ideas to others. You have the analytical practitioner. This is someone who succeeds in conventional terms because high IQ is translated into practical work, but he's unlikely to make a lasting contribution. And then you have the creative practitioner. This is someone who has the ability to come up with new ideas and can persuade other people in the value of these ideas, regardless of whether those ideas are worth it or not. And finally, you have the consummate balancer. This is someone who is able to apply all 3 intelligences as needed and is therefore in the best position to make a valuable contribution to society. Our next theorist is Daniel Goleman. He's a theorist that put forth this idea of emotional intelligence, or EQ. This is a set of skills that underlie the accurate assessment, evaluation, expression, and regulation of emotions. And he pointed out that this set of skills is also important to the intelligence conversation. So let's talk about what emotional intelligence is. This aspect of intelligence underlies the ability to get along well with others, and shows that while individuals may not have high traditional IQ scores, they can be extremely successful due to a high EQ because they can read people. Let's discuss the components of EQ. First, you have to be able to perceive the emotion. You recognize emotions well in faces, music, and stories. You can understand emotion. You predict emotions and how they will change and blend as time goes forward. And then you can manage emotion. This is the ability to express emotions in different situations. Again, kind of knowing what fits in different scenarios. And lastly, you are able to use the emotion. You can utilize emotions to adapt or be creative. Gardner and others criticize the idea of emotional intelligence and question whether we stretch this idea of intelligence too far when we apply it to emotions. Plus, it really is very difficult to test. It hasn't really been quantified in a rigorous manner yet. There's also a lot of controversy around the teaching of EQ because a lot of people believe this shouldn't be taught by anyone other than families. Next, we go into intelligence and creativity. Creativity is the ability to produce ideas that are both novel and valuable. It correlates somewhat with intelligence, and it includes the following factors. Expertise. This is basically a well-developed knowledge base. Imaginative thinking. This is the ability to see things in novel ways. Usually someone who is creative has somewhat of an adventuresome personality, so this person seeks new experiences rather than following the pack. They are intrinsically motivated. We will talk more about this in a future unit, but basically this is motivation to create from within. This comes from inside. And then lastly, a creative environment. Creativity blooms in creative and supportive environments. So let me ask you this. Do you think that intelligence is neurologically measurable? Is it something that we can actually see in a different type of scan or some type of measurement in the brain? Recent studies indicate some correlation, not a perfect correlation, but there is some correlation between brain size and intelligence. Basically, as brain size decreases with age, so do scores on verbal intelligence. However, more importantly is that gray matter concentration is higher in people with high intelligence. Studies of brain functioning show that people who score high in intelligence tests perceive stimuli faster, retrieve information from memory more quickly, and show faster brain response times. Ultimately, it's not specifically about the size of brain, it's about the neural connections that can act quickly, the speed of processing. Density matters, not size. You have two types of intelligence that are measurable. You have crystallized intelligence. Think of this as knowledge for hard facts, the accumulation of knowledge, facts, and skills that are acquired throughout your life. Then you have fluid intelligence. This is the ability to decipher information and make decisions, especially in new situations, which is more difficult at an old age, so it decreases as we age, basically past middle adulthood. So let's talk about the Flynn effect. This is a theory put forth by Professor James Flynn, and basically what he said was that there's a trend of increasing intelligence scores as time passes. And we know that that is true to a point. And just a little piece of information, he was very, very active until his death in December of 2020. Okay, we're going to watch a short video, and what I want to warn you about is that Dr. Flynn uses some identifying language as far as racial differences. This is an area of intelligence that has been somewhat studied. This is an older video, and it's still very valuable in understanding some of the findings that we have in the area of intelligence research. So let's watch this interview with Dr. James Flynn.
What he discovered turned IQ research on its head and became known as the Flynn effect.
All throughout the 20th century, we can trace that each generation is scoring higher than its predecessor. That is, the average person on Ravens today is by definition 100. The average person in 1900 scored against current norms would have been somewhere between 50 and 70.
Trawling through huge quantities of raw data Flynn noticed that IQ scores have risen on average by about 3 points per decade. He also found that the rise for black Americans was even faster. The IQ gap between blacks and whites was actually closing.
Blacks have gained at a faster rate than whites since World War II, certainly. Whites have been gaining something under 0.3 of a point a year, and blacks at about 4.45 points a year. In other words, blacks have been gaining about 50% faster during that period. Now, does that prove that the difference between the two isn't genetic? Well, it certainly shows that differences as great as the IQ gap can be closed environmentally.
Flynn's explanation isn't that we're getting smarter or that our ancestors were dumber. The fundamental difference, he says, is that our great-grandparents had learned how to manipulate the world practically. But we've learned how to classify it intellectually. If they were asked to explain the relationship between a dog and a rabbit, they are likely to have said that one chases the other. We're more likely to say they're both mammals. Flynn believes that in the last half-century we have undergone a profound change in the way we think. A change that few of us are even aware of. He calls it the cognitive revolution. Since the end of World War II, our everyday lives have become ever more dominated by the need to think in abstract categories. The explosive growth of science and technology in the workplace, at home and in our schools requires that we sort our world by conceptualizing it. In essence, we view the world through what Flynn calls scientific spectacles. Now, it so happens that this kind of thinking is exactly what's required to do well in an IQ test. Which means we can give a fairly precise definition of what IQ tests measure. They give a score not for intelligence as such, but for our adaptation to modernity.
Let's talk about another psychological concept known as a stereotype threat. This is a situational predicament where people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. Stereotype threat is purportedly a contributing factor to longstanding racial and gender gaps in academic performance. Basically, what we have seen in research, if you have to identify yourself as being in a racial or gender group that is typically stereotyped to not do well in that test, you actually do worse than if you did not have to identify yourself as being part of that group. I'll give you another example in just a second, and we will talk a little bit more about this when we get into the unit that involves stereotype, but it does factor into intelligence and how intelligence is assessed and how sometimes our performance on a test isn't exactly what we are able to do. Let's say there's a female who's taking her driver's test. The instructor who will be observing and determining if she passes is an older male. She's keenly aware of the stereotype about young female drivers in the eyes of men, and because she's so nervous about that stereotype, she ends up living up or living down to it. So her performance is affected by her awareness that there's a stereotype against her in this particular scenario. What I want you to do is, on your notes, try and come up with another example. Try to make it about your own social group and have just enough political correctness and kindness, please. And that is it for our introduction to intelligence. In our next video, we'll be talking about how we assess intelligence. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.